also follow us on LinkedIn. There you'll also see details of upcoming webinars in the series, and you can find recordings of all of our previous webinars on our YouTube channel. So before I hand over to Dr. Corvaglia, I would like to just remind you of the webinar etiquette. So please do ensure that your cameras and microphones are switched off for the duration of the webinar. The presentation is going to take about 20 minutes, and during that time I want to encourage you to use the chat function selected with address to everyone to post your questions and comments, and then at the end of the presentation there's going to be about 10 minutes of Q&A, and I'll collate all of those questions from the chat for that Q&A. And then just also a reminder, the seminar is being recorded, and as I mentioned, the recording is going to be made available via YouTube. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce and hand over to Dr. Maria Anna Corvaglia.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being here, even if it's a summer season, and thank you for listening. I will. It's a great pleasure to present my research that I'm developing together with Dr. Arinze Okiche, that is it's a lecturer from the Leicester Law School that is with us today, and it will interact with us today in the chat. Just I will give a brief introduction now of myself and Arinze. As I said, and then I will explain what is the background, our personal background, and what is the background of this research, in order to show you how this research fill a gap in the current literature. I will try to explain the scope and the objective of our work, our ambitions and our challenge, and our preliminary conclusion. Because this is a work in progress, I welcome every feedback and input. So please, if you are interested in discussing this now or later on, or if you're looking at this and not live, please get in touch with us, and we will be happy to share more data and discuss it further. So, as Stephen kindly said in the introduction, I am a lecturer at the Business Law School, and I specialize in what? In international trade law, and how trade is, and how sustainable development and trade are balanced together in international trade agreement. While Arinze, working with me, is specialized on African regionalism. So, next slide. Our main starting point is researching African regionalism. African regionalism has a fascinating history, and there's a very substantial body of literature that developed, that analyzed the different phase of African regionalism, and also the different area of collaboration among African countries, from the very described as a success story in the security area to the different form of implementation of integration of trade among African countries. We are both lawyers, and we start to look at the institutional design of what they are called regional economic community, because intra-African trade, so the trade among African countries, is pursued mainly through regional economic community, with a various number of member states, or regional trade agreement, very few bilateral. So these institutions are the main driver that allow trade among African countries. There are various. There are 8 regional economic communities recognized by the African Union, and they have a different level of economic integration. Certain have just a free trade agreement with eliminating trade barrier, others are more a custom union or a common market. The African trade regionalism has been described as an economic project that is weakened by a series of characteristics. Mainly the overlapping membership of regional of economic community, with the risk of conflicting commitment, the lack of policy coordination, and some different form of institutional and financial weakness. So this has been what has been said so far, but this is also a very frequently moving reality, because we have an African continental free trade area that has been formed in 2018 and in force since 2019, that is the most recent and wide expression of intra-African trade and institution, a very ambitious economic form of integration that is only partially active at the moment. So if this is the landscape of institution happening in African trade regionalism. Next. What and the main legal characteristic is that these are institutional, different body, very legalized. Every institution has their own court, and but they are often described as some form of flexible type of commitment. We will see in a minute what happened. On a parallel level, if the literature on African trade regionalism is well developed, another line of literature where we're working is green regionalism. What does it mean? How much in regional trade or preferential trade agreement, environmental committed are used. So what form of trade measure and trade committed are embedded into trade agreement. So using trade as a driver to sustainable development. Why? Because since 2005, an increasing number of preferential trade agreements include more and more environmental commitment. These environmental commitments are deeply studied and categorized in different levels. There's been described as a deep or shallow type of commitment, hard law or soft law form of commitment. That has been coded by different institutions, the World Bank of the WTO, as in form of inspirational commitment, more binding commitment, or subject or not to dispute settlement mechanism. Often this type of provision to protect the environment embedded in trade agreement has been measured with reference to the regulatory standard of the WTO. So coded as WTO equal, WTO plus, or WTO extra. So if in studying both of us, these two lines of literature, we found that there is a substantial gap. What is it? Specifically, how much, how are understudied the norms of that aim at protecting the environment inside intra-African trade or intra-African institution. These forms of environmental commitment are very frequently included in what are called in agreement among high income or middle income country, and often described as north-north kind of agreement, considering the membership of the country, or north-south type of agreement. What has not been studied so far is south-south type of agreement, and most precisely the type of environmental commitment that are included into the African Regional Economic Community. Next. For this reason, what we wanted to achieve with this project is to enrich these two lines of literature and mainly challenge an assumption that is widespread now in the trade field. What is this assumption? The assumption that Environmental commitment are only included in the form of north-south type of agreement or north-north kind of agreement, because these environmental priority are a priority of Western country, or North country, that are imposed on their South counterpart in exchange of market access gain into their trade agreement. So what we want to test and prove is the possibility to see if there are environmental priority inside intra-African institution, and basically see what effort has been done, study them, and rationalize this effort. So we ask ourselves, what is the design of this form? Are the effort that has been done in the literature so far to categorize, as I said before, the different form of environmental commitment, is this a type of analysis or a type of coding mechanism that fits all? And also it's adequate to capture the reality of African regionalism? And what is the specific design of these norms? With the thinking that this form of institution could represent the main driver to foster sustainable development mechanism that are generated, so they are environmental priority of African country part of this agreement, and they can foster not only intra-African trade, but sustainable intra-African trade. This was our great ambition when we start this project. Unfortunately, and I'm still saying, it's a working process here, because we are facing major research challenges that are not blocking us, but also are making feeling that this work is particularly needed. What are the difficulties? The difficulties to access official documentation. So far, unless few non-profit organizations is there that try to compile the different official document of this African regional economic community, we have we experience serious challenge to access to the different document, even the founding treaties of this organization, because there are maybe different revised form of the agreement. There are different protocol has been adopted, but it's there's no a complete, or even if there are different not at most updated compilation, categorization of all this legal instrument, leave it aside the different policies that get implemented by them. So we had, in front of this difficulties, we have the long-term ambition to start to build in the future a certain a database. We start collecting the document, we try to collect the document in the most updated or revised form. And we are trying to identify what are these protocols are in force, what are they active and functional, and what are not enforced anymore. And as I said, anymore, not only collect, but also rationalize the body of provision and norms that this community created so far. Next. So in this very confusing landscape, we try to start to establish a comparative analysis. We start trying to map the different African economic community. As I said at the beginning, the African Union, that is the main political driver of African regionalism, recognize 8 forms of economic community. We decide to start or to develop the analysis only in 4. These 4 community are the Economic Community of Western African Countries, the ECOWAS, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA, the East African Community, and the Southern African Development Community, the SADC. Why? What happened to the other 4? That's a very legitimate question. Well, first of all, we decided to focus on this because these 4 are the main community that cover the majority of the substantial value of intra-African trade. And we know from the economic and political economy literature so far, intra-African trade is not as substantial as extra-African trade, but still, to make this research relevant, we decided to focus only on those that match a certain minimum threshold of intra-African trade. Those are the institutions with the most developed and legalized framework in terms of their own organization. For this reason, these are the most influential also compared to the African context. Just to give you an example, the Intergovernmental Authority Development, that is one of the 8 organizations, only focus on the security of Horn of Africa, or the Arab Maghreb Union, for example, didn't meet in the last 20 years because of the rivalry of Morocco and Algeria. So we decide only to focus on the most active community, the most developed, the most legalized, covering the majority of intra-African trade. We decided to compile, document, and read document with developing qualitative analysis. So read the provision and look at what is the design of the provision, what is the novelty of the provision, and what is the wording and how different is the wording compared to what has been done so far in terms of environmental norms, how different they are compared to environmental commitment included in a trade agreement with Western or big country like the EU of the US or China. We try to compile treaties, additional protocol, and mention subsequent policy, mainly focusing on the environment. And we look at 4 main variables in the study of this 4 economic community. We look at what are the objectives, what are the environmental, the objective of protecting the environment inside this community, is what kind of obligation comes from this big objective, and what is the regulatory design? Are these norms in the main constitutional treaty of the community or in an additional protocol? Is this enforceable or not? The dispute settlement mechanism it would be possible to trigger a dispute settlement mechanism in case of a or alleged violation of the environmental commitment in this treaty. Then, because these are treaties that aim at economic collaboration, we are looking in terms of second category of analysis, the balance between trade and environmental goals. And we compare to the WTO, are therefore more of a general exception that allow the possibility to use discriminatory trade policy for the protection of the environment, or are there form of prohibition of dilution? What does it mean? Is that is clearly prohibited that the environmental standards are lowered in the community in order to attract foreign trade or foreign investment? This is the provision of dilution. Then we try to map as a third category of variable what are the specific environmental area. And we look as I said before, the specific legal status and the enforcement mechanism for these provisions. Next. We use we measure, we start to develop our mapping exercise on the base of what has been so far published as the most influential mapping exercise of trade agreement. That is the World Bank database on deep trade agreement. And we cross-reference with the WTO environmental measure database. Both the World Bank agreement set a very long list of and code the different agreement on it based on a very long list of environmental protection area that this you can see on this slide. So what we try to do is to see that we took all the different coding mechanism that the World Bank developed, and we see if this is suitable or not in order to capture the nuance characteristic of African regionalism, and we see if the different pattern that has been developed and has been tested by the World Bank in North-South type of agreement is also witnessed in the regional economic community. So, for example, we see if when we studied all the different area of protection, we wanted to see if the different regional economic community in the framework of what are all the possible environmental protection area developed so far, how many of this area are covered or not by all the different regional economic community? Do they are interested in fishery management or the management of water resource, or they are more concerned on the prevention of pollution or the requirement to control ozone depleting substance? How much is an interest of regional African community, for example, the promotion or protection of biodiversity or renewable energy? In all this, trying to see and highlight different priorities of protection area, we also notice that big three kind of topics start to merge with each other. So in this community, the protection of the environment very much overlap with the objective to foster sustainable agriculture and to have a deep focus, a deep type of provision on the support of renewable energy resources. And so that was what interesting in order to understand what kind of vision of protection of the environment this regional economic community developed. And of course, if you want to know more about the kind of how much this different area are covered in the different community, please get in touch with me. So what if this is what I've been trying to do, what I've been found so far? Next. So we can have some preliminary conclusion that can be grouped in four main messages. First of all, there is a lot of ambition and a lot of policy space that is reserved for the protection of the environment in African regional economic community. So this is not just a priority of Western country, and not just a priority into, for example, the trade agreement signed by the EU or China when they ratify with African countries. But there is a big space. There is a lot of commitment, but there's also a great variation of commitment. There are different forms of depth of commitment. There are certain community like COMESA that has extremely detailed form of commitment, while the East African community has very much aspirational form of commitment aiming at the cooperation of them. But nevertheless, all this regional economic community include sustainable development in their own future ambition to to economic integration. What is also interesting and a bit counterintuitive that things we saw is not necessarily the community that have a deeper economic or trade integration have a deeper environmental commitment. So it's not just simply related to that this is the case of the East African community, that is one that has the most ambitious form of trade integration, but the most aspirational form of environmental commitment. So this is the main first message. Second, the African regional economic community have a slightly different environmental priority if we compare with the type of agreements that are pursued into north-south or north-north kind of preferential trade agreement. Together as the big objective of like protection of the environment and sustainable agriculture and renewable energy that I said before, two are the other area that emerge as a clear priority in all this community. Deforestation, the prevention of form of deforestation and desertification. And the other one that is a strong constant in all the treaty and protocol that we saw is a lot of attention on waste management. The two area where north-south or north-north preferential trade agreement have been very recently focused are extractive resource fishery subsidies. The prohibition of fishery subsidies is never considered a priority in African regional economic community. The management of water resources, yes, but not the prohibition of harmful fishery subsidies, even if this is like the hottest topic in north-south or north-north agreements so far. And the sustainable management of extractive resources is often not included in the treaties, but only it's a priority that emerged only later on in the policy and the document of East African country. What else? Next. There is, next slide. So there are provision, they have different priority, and they have a different regulatory design. What does it mean? These are, there is, it's very difficult, we don't find a lot of attention on how to balance trade and sustainable development. There are treaties with general exception, but what is perceived as one of the most intrusive form of environmental provision, or more effective, is the general provision of dilution of environment protection in order to promote trade and investment. This is something that in the form that we find in North-South or North-North agreement, we don't see it replicated in the regional economic community. Only the COMESA Treaty acknowledge the harmful impact of environment that trade and investment can have and how to limit. They are not a frequent form of reference or the positive commitment to join or ratify specific environmental agreement and the compliance of that. That is another type of commitment that you find in North-South or North-North agreement. And what is interesting is the enforceability of this provision. There are a lot of provisions, they are detailed, but their enforceability is questionable. So there's a lot of discussion about legalization of that and how much the dispute settlement mechanism established in this regional economic community could be triggered for a violation of the environmental commitment. But it's very, a lot of this provision, mainly included in the protocol, it's not clear if they are enforceable. They are influential, doesn't mean the possibility to trigger dispute settlement mechanism doesn't mean that this provision are not important or do not trigger a positive impact on the fostering sustainability. It's just that it's not possible to trigger the dispute settlement or traditional form of enforcement mechanism. And this brings to the end of the presentation in order to allow more questions. What is clearly a very confusing and overlapping framework or overview that I'm picturing, what doesn't mean in terms of fragmentation? Well, the variety of trade agreement and the variety of different form of environmental commitment, it's a clear case of lack of cooperation between this institution. It not necessarily mean conflict of norm. It doesn't necessarily mean fragmentation. Lack of cooperation, overlapping effort, yes, but not necessarily fragmentation of conflict of norm of authorities. The African Continental Free Trade Area has a big role looking in the future in order to coordinate all this environmental effort in their own treaty they have and protocols. They have a lot of environmental form, but what is particularly interesting is the African Free Continental Area recognize the regional economic community as the building blocks to African integration. So it's a process that should start, and it's important to look at the role of regional economic community, because these are the building blocks of later agreement and the design of African regionalism. And this is where they could actually, there's a lot of action and can actually make a very positive contribution to a more sustainable intra-African trade. And thank you. And as I said, this is just a preliminary scope, and more are we working on that, more are we looking future direction for research, seeing the main country driver inside this area or different form of comparison. So please get in touch with us if you have any question or any idea on this. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Maria Anna. Please do post questions in the chat. We've got a few minutes. There aren't any questions in there yet, so I'll take the chair's privilege and I'll ask a few of my own whilst others are thinking. Yeah, I'm really interested to understand a bit more about what the negotiations around regional trade agreements look like. So just thinking about the Continental Free Trade Agreement, what are some of perhaps the most like contentious issues in there that might be preventing agreement being reached, and who are the actors that are really kind of pushing for that agreement, who's driving ambition around environmental targets within the African Free Trade Agreement, and are there other actors that are perhaps blocking or vetoing things? Is there any kind of insight you can give us into that process?
That is very interesting in terms of actors, in the sense that a lot of the more political science literature that comes to African regionalism look at the weakness, what is happening as mainly the weakness of the state, or African state, and big country may be a bigger driver in different regional community, and then big driver in the African Free Continental Area. So the problem is that, and so you can see this form of different geometry of commitment on the base of the membership of this community, where all this different community of big country actors that they push the agenda on a different level, and they may shape the agenda of the community and then shape the agenda of the African free trade economic free trade agreement. What is the problem there is that, and why my attention was on the overlap between trade and environment, because when we talk about the trade part of this agreement, including the African Free Trade Agreement, we talk about the enforcement part. Okay, unfortunately, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is not operational now, because of a problem of rule of origin, details on the problem of rule of origin there. And my co-author knows a lot about this. So often the technical implementation of the big treaty that has a lot of ambition is the main barrier to the actual impact of all this form of agreement. Because there is a lot of study on what are the political actors behind. So far, we look at the operational of these norms from a legal perspective. Are these enforceable? And if they are enforceable, can they have a bigger impact on that? Usually the trade chapter of this community are the one that are enforceable and the one where a lot of attention for economic reason are pushed through. But like in the case of the continental free trade area, they are not operational. So not being operational and lacking the last technical implementation effort, that could undermine the big ambitions that they can, or the nice inspirational wording that are included in the treaty. And of course, the pressure of different countries can vary when it comes to specific technical trade issues.
So is it potentially the case that in trying to achieve regional trade agreements, there may need to be compromises in the environmental commitments? Is there a potential trade-off there between the ambition to establish the operational agreement and the strength of environmental commitment that allows for?
Yeah, that's why I stress a lot this idea of the prohibition of dilution. So and why it's the balance between trade commitment, because these are communities with a lot of ambitions of creating custom union, a common market. So if how you balance the big ambition and priority to develop trade among African countries, and how can you do this also developing sustainable trade among this country? So for this reason, it would be important to have commitment like, or recognize the harmful impact that trade has on of the environment, in order to not only have maybe uncoordinated commitment to develop trade and protect the environment, but making sure that the development of trade is not done in a harmful way to the environment. So that kind of form of commitment would be particularly important to channel there. And unfortunately, and these are the kind of provisions that often are challenged in climate litigation, in other form of agreement. So this is what we can see. There is a lot of priorities. That is clear priority on waste management, for example, different form of coordination of that. But how can you develop what are the best channel in a legal form to ensure that there's not an harmful impact for the environment to be something that could be interesting, especially when it comes to sustainable agriculture and the effort that all this community are developing there. I don't know if I address.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. I'll ask one more. I think we've got time to squeeze one more in. I guess it relates to what you were saying, and it's really thinking about the practical implementation of some of the environmental regulation commitments. We know that when we talk about like deforestation-free supply chains, there's one thing putting that in law, there's quite another to actually be able to trace those things through often quite complex supply chains and attribute responsibilities for those things. How much is the sort of the practical challenges around environmental regulation? How much does that kind of constrain or influence the more legalistic kind of regulatory dialogue and decision making?
Well, and sorry to put it, thank you. And sorry to put it in a very simple term, but it's also, so if this, in order to track deforestation, in order to track and to see how much this is not just an individual, I mean, is not just a simple, to see to see this regional economic community as a building blocks for regionalism and foster a positive economic and environmental development. The main issue from a legal point of view is simply to understand what is enforced or not. Okay, and that was one of the main difficulties that we had in our research. To put it very simple, we had plenty of fights with my co-author that said, no, this article, you mentioned a wrong article. No, you're looking at the different version of the agreement, because the lack of a clear systematization of what is there, what is just an inspirational form, what is enforceable or not. Okay, what is enforced or not, before asking if it's enforceable. This it's something that is it was the main difficult challenge, because if this regional blocks could challenge the coordination of the effort, it's also important to understand that these are just not overlapping treaties that may be ambitious, but they don't bring any form of commitment into the cooperation. So that was one of the biggest challenge that I think see that the work of that could impede the work of this organization, but also the research in order to track the effort, because you said it's very difficult to track in a supply chain, but also it's very difficult to track what is the legal development, which more recent protocol brings the older protocol in obsolete and not enforceable anymore, for example. So this is the kind of work that I think it's under study or not looked enough, and also to see put in a more relative or critical matter, what could work to foster or to code development in the North-South agreement. It's not just a one-size-fits-all. So we kind of need to study this form of agreement, taking an inspiration of what has been done in other contexts, in all the literature so far. That it's what I've been doing so far in my previous work, but also to see if does it make justice to all this different effort, and not simply describe as inspirations of law, but actually there could be a force for good or for further development.
Great. We've had a couple of questions come through the chat at the last minute, but we are just about out of time. I think Arinze has been keeping an eye also on the chat.
Yeah.
I don't know if you would like to try to respond to any of those questions in 1 minute. The floor is yours to do that, and then I'll wrap up.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Mariana, for interesting presentation. So very quickly, I'm just going to say that one question was about environmental priorities with respect to plastics. I think we see that most of those in the soft law instruments. I know in ECOWAS and West Africa, there's a lot of focus on plastics and textile waste. But we don't see anything in the agreement, in the legalized part of the agreement, that stress on a particular aspects of waste. So we just see it a bit more generally. Very quickly, as to the second question by Ruth, I think the focus has now the focus now is on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and making sure that it is fully operational. As Mariana said, the issue that you have currently with the agreement is that the rules of origin has not been resolved. But the Secretary is working so much in relation to resolving them. I think, and this relates to the second aspect of the question, I think that there's a lot of soft law instrument going on with regards to the environmental considerations of the agreement. And I think there's some leeway that the AFTA can provide the coordination mechanism with respect to the building blocks, which are the regional trade agreements. I think that if a lot of awareness is brought to what the AFTA can do, I think especially with the considerable emphasis on the environment, I think the AFTA can really be a kind of a bulwark to ensure that environmental priorities are protected. I think what our research is revealing is that you have a lot, even in disagreement. I'm not sure African countries know that, sometimes there's no awareness of what is included in the agreement. Regards to women, I'm sorry, I'm going quite a bit fast, but just because we're out of time. But regards to women, again, we see that a lot in the soft law instruments. And I think that if we eventually get the AFTA to be fully operational, I think that there's some ambit in the agreement to make sure that these areas are protected. Standard theory of political influence. I'm not a political, I think Mariana is probably better to answer this, but I'm not a political theorist. I'm just a legal person, so I'm not sure aware of the theories. But what I would say with regards to any study of African regionalism is that you obviously have a lot of big players, so Nigeria in ECOWAS, South Africa in Central Africa, in Southern Africa, Kenya in East Africa, and they kind of play a huge role in certain direction of how regionalism would go. But as I said, I'm not sure what the mainstream theory is. But again, also going to the fact of what is delaying these things, even the influence of these big players, Nigeria and ECOWAS and Kenya and East African community and South Africa, it's part of what the issues are, I would say, because everyone is just trying to get their influence across. I'm sorry I couldn't go a bit more.
No, that's okay. Thank you for going through those questions so quickly. Because we are out of time, we're going to have to unfortunately leave it there, but I'll share the questions from the chat with you, Maria Anna and Irinze, and if you want to respond to anyone by email, then you could do it that way.
If the one about theory, I'm happy to develop more the kicking the ladder theory and how this fits with our work. So just drop me an email, and I'm happy to articulate a more theoretical, political background of that.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Maria Anna and
thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And thank you all for joining. We'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.